Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Okay, so hello everyone. As already mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about upscaling today, specifically on the lab scale. But first, I quickly want to introduce you to the place that I'm working and what we're doing. So I'm part of the Solar Factory of the Future. It's located at the Energy Campus in Nuremberg. We have quite huge lab facilities and also special equipment like accelerated doctor blades, inkjet printers, WVTR, OTR, climate chambers, anything you would need for a lifetime in encapsulation testing, a AAA class solar simulator, and a very something very special, a 15-meter long multi-head machine with 3 coating stations, and an inline laser for on-the-fly patterning, as well as a nanosecond and femtosecond laser system. And the key achievements of the Solar Factory of the Future are 2 NREL certified world records in the OPV module efficiency chart in 2019 and the most recent one in 2023. Okay, about upscaling. What are the requirements? Because before we start with anything, we should know what do we need? What is the starting point? So there's a very nice paper from Eva Herzig on what we should focus whenever we want to try to harmonize academia and industry. So firstly, what is very important that the materials that we use are scalable, because if we want to have an actual technology industry, we need a lot of material. Then, of course, the solvent is very important that we're going to use that we use scalable processes like blade coating and slot die coating. And what would also be very appealing is fully solution process devices, because we want to use roll-to-roll processes. And for that, we would also require processes that work under ambient conditions and without any vacuum processes. And in total, the material and the devices should be stable, and ideally, of course, flexible substrates for roll-to-roll processing. Okay, so at first, starting point is material screening. So I just put a couple of quite famous or notable molecules and phase donors and polymers on here. So how can we categorize them? How can we distinguish what kind of material we could use for upscaling? So firstly, and for me personally, one of the most important requirements, because it already takes a lot of materials out of the equation, would be the solvent. So on the left-hand side, you can see a chart, what efficiencies we can expect from which solvent, according to literature. Of course, for different active layer systems, but those are mainly champion efficiencies, and how toxic they are. So LD is lethal doses. It's a rough estimate that tells you how toxic a material is. So one of the most used solvents in literature is chloroform. And as you can see, it's very toxic compared to others, but it also gives great efficiencies. And for us personally, the optimum trade-off is with oxalene, because the efficiencies are comparably similar to chloroform. However, the toxicity is a lot less. So that's quite important to us. And so why is the solvent important? The solvent directly affects the morphology of our active layers in OPV. So if we have a low boiling solvent, we usually see fast evaporation, and that usually gives us smaller domain sizes, and that leads to a better charge dissociation. So I have a small simulation by Max Steinberger and Maxim Sieber that really shows you that you can see quite fine domains here for the fast evaporating solvent, sorry. And for the high boiling solvent, you can tell that the domains are significantly bigger, and with that, we have worse charge dissociation. So ideally, we'll have a lower boiling solvent that gives us the desired morphology. So with that said, we can already take out some of the materials that I suggested here, and some others were taken out because they usually, according to literature, lead to instability of our devices. So with those candidates that we still have left, we tried a couple devices. This is all 0.1 square centimeter cells with 100 nanometers of evaporated silver. One of the classy materials as of now for upscaling is PTQ10. It is often used in combination with Y6012 or Y12, you have whatever you want to call it. But in this testing, in the screening, it showed poor fill factors, specifically compared to all the other competitors that we have. It already gets better with the next candidate that uses L8BO as a non-fullerene acceptor. However, here it really lacks in current density, and also the VOC is a lot lower compared to the PTQ10 Y12. But however, the fill factor is a lot higher. So if we're then moving to PM6 as the donor polymer and combine it with L8BO, we can see an increase in JSC and maintain the high fill factors. And also a VOC again is quite nice. So here we are already at an average of slightly over 14% in PCE. And then we replace the L8BO by Y12. Both molecules are actually quite close to each other structure-wise. However, in the testing stack that we used, we got the highest fill factors and the highest JC by using Y12 rather than L8BO, which surprised us. So that's where we got an average PCE of 14.62%. So that's why we chose that active layer system for upscaling. So PM6, because in general, you get quite high efficiencies and there is a lot of research done on it, and also a lot of champion devices are made with PM6. However, it struggles a little bit in stability. The Y6012 has great solubility, specifically in xylene, and even sometimes shows higher efficiencies in xylene compared to chloroform. And it is reported to be extremely stable. And actually, according to a paper by Zhu et al., it's even the most stable Y series NFA. And to add up in efficiency and stability, we added a slight amount of PC60BM into the active layer because it helps with charge dissociation. And since it's a great radical scavenger, it also helps with stability in ternary systems. And it's cheaper than PC71BM, where we didn't find any big differences in efficiency. So next step, now that we finally chose our active layer, we have to optimize our other functional layers. So we started with the ETL, and we compared some commercially available nanoparticle inks based on zinc oxide and thin oxide to a homemade sol gel zinc oxide. And as you can directly see, the fill factors for the nanoparticle-based devices was actually higher. However, interestingly, the JSC was higher for the sol gel zinc oxide because it is a very dense, thin layer, and that also helps to get more light into your cells. And those devices were all based on molybdenum oxide. But then, of course, we also have HDLs available that are solution processable, which in the end would be our goal. So we used P.F and BM-HTL1 and compared it to molybdenum oxide. And while BM-HTL1 for the same coating parameters as P.F struggled a little bit while still maintaining a high fill factor, but showed slight losses in JSC, with P.F we get really high current densities that are significantly higher than with molybdenum oxide. We get a quite high VOC in this specific experiment and with very high fill factors. And we ended up with 15.5% PCE on average for devices in this experiment. So hence we decided to use the sol gel as the ETL and P.F as the whole transport layer. And not only the ETLs play a big role, of course, again, the active layer the thickness of the active layer has some effect to the efficiency of our devices. Because what we usually see as a trend, the thicker we make a layer, if you just think about it, you should absorb more light. However, you would also, due to the restricted charge carrier mobility, you would also lose in fill factor in your devices. So to show the trend, we actually fabricated devices with different active layer thicknesses and had a look at the trends that we can see. So the VOC remains fairly stable. The fill factors are decreasing as expected, but what was very interesting is that we don't see a linear increase in current density. We see a dip in certain thickness ranges. And we wanted to know what is the reason for that. So we used optical simulations to check whether it's an interference effect or not. And as you can see, the simulation fits the data quite nicely. So it's really an interference effect due to the back reflecting silver electrode that actually leads to lower current densities, even though we increase the active layer thickness. And in this chart, you can see that if we go to thinner active layers, we can get higher efficiencies as long as we're using evaporated silver electrodes as our top electrode. And then as we're talking about upscaling, this is work that was done by one of my master students, Aral Karahan. We worked on 1 square centimeter cells. And we got some very nice results. So his champion device achieved 15.3% on 1 square centimeters. And then we added an anti-reflection film that is just a coating. So like a flexible film that you can just apply with an adhesive on the backside of the cells. And that boosts our current density significantly. And we ended up with a champion device that achieved an efficiency of 15.9% on a 1 square centimeter cell. So that's really high. However, we're talking about upscalable processes and materials. So we have to transfer or get rid of our evaporated silver electrode. And with nanowires, the trends are are completely different. So nanowires are preferred top electrode of choice in this case because they're easy to coat, they work well with blade coating, and they even allow for semi-transparency. But due to the semi-transparency, we also lose the back reflection or a significant amount of it. So to counteract the effect of current density losses, we have to increase the active layer thickness in order to absorb more photons again and increase our JSC. And that's actually a quite nice trend that you can also see. And again, we fitted it to our model in the optical simulations. And as you can see, it fits again quite well. And we can achieve very high JSCs of more than 23 milliamps in a semi-transparent device, while maintaining comparably high fill factors of more than 60 for those thicknesses. And that allowed us to get quite close to 12% in a semi-transparent device. This is again 0.1 square centimeter cells, and the average, of course, given with error bars. Okay, but for the next thing, when we talk about devices that are significantly bigger than 1-inch substrates, we have to talk a little bit about the theory of our processing. So we use blade coating for all of our devices, and we in general do it in ambient conditions. So we don't use the glove box for coating or anything. So for all of those who are not that familiar with blade coating and slot die coating, I want to give you a quick roundup how it works. So in general, we have an advancing meniscus on the front end side of our blade coating that determines the wetting in the end of our ink. And then we have the more important receding meniscus that is on the back end side of our applicator. And the shape of this meniscus directly determines the thickness of our film, of our wet film and of our dry film in the end, due to the concentration. So the film solidification lags far behind our receding meniscus because we're not in the evaporation regime. We're in the so-called Landau-Levitt regime for our typical coating parameters. And this regime has a distinct feature that by increasing our coating speed, we end up with thicker layers, which in the beginning sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but that's how we can adjust our thickness of our coatings. So then the next thing, what else can we modify when we're talking about slot die coating and blade coating? We can modify the thickness by adjusting the temperature. As you can see on the graph on the top left, if we use 40 degrees for the same volume and the same speed, we end up with thicker layers compared to 70 degrees Celsius. So we can use the temperature to modify our thickness, but also we can use it to accelerate our evaporation. So we can use it in two ways. The other thing we can do, we can play around with the volume. As you can see on the bottom left, if the volume has a direct impact on the thickness of our coating because it directly affects the receding meniscus. The more volume, the higher the meniscus, the higher the dry film and the wet film. The viscosity plays a quite big role. So the lower our viscosity, the thinner our layers will be. And for the surface tension, the higher the surface tension, the thinner our layers will be in blade coating. So on large areas, we usually have a volume loss at some point because we use small amounts, only 55 microliters. And if we coat along, we lose in volume. So a loss in volume means that we end up with thinner wet films and thinner dry films. So to counteract that, we can use acceleration because as we learned, the faster we go, the thicker we get. So to balance that off, we used CFD simulations to find out how we have to adjust our acceleration profiles to get to homogeneous layers. And this was work that was mainly done by Andreas Dissler, who is my group leader, Fabian Gumpert, Jan Lobreyer, and Annika Jansen, who was a bachelor student at the Solar Factory of the Future. Some other things that they found, if we go to quite high coating speeds, the meniscus is not symmetric anymore. So we have a shift opposite to the coating direction that has to be taken account for because it directly impacts the thickness of our coating. So those guys that I just mentioned came up with a theory based on the CFD models. And we are with a theoretical formula that allows you to calculate the speed that you have to use on a given point X after the starting point to get the desired thickness. This formula uses the surface energy and the dynamic viscosity as some of the main impact factors next to all of the geometries that you can see on the left-hand side. But they also, to make things a little bit easier, they also found a fit formula that works well with the theoretical formula that uses a power law coefficient that from the fits that you get for the wet film thickness to the corresponding coating velocity. Then the intersection of the fit with the y-axis gives you the B parameter, and the C parameter is the slope of the graph that you can see in the bottom middle. And if you put those into your fit formula, you should end up with an acceleration profile that just works to get a homogeneous coating. Oops. Okay, so with the input parameters that we have here, we now needed it for our systems. So for the inks that we use. So we did creep and recovery measurements with the rheometer to find out what the dynamic viscosity was. And we used the pendant drop method and the formula that I gave you underneath the droplets to calculate the surface energy. And with those input parameters, we were able to use CFD simulations again to get our B and C vectors. And with that, you can see that the applied profiles that we used to get the homogeneous layers fit very well to the simulated ones according to the fit. So this fit formula can help you if you know the viscosity and the surface energy to get homogeneous coatings even over large areas if you use the same geometry as we did. So you need the same applicator. That's also very important. And with that, we can achieve very homogeneous coatings. So you have here you can see the average thickness over 16.5 times 16.5 inch centimeter substrate. And you also see a picture of the coating on the right-hand side. So this works quite well, and it's actually something that can be used universal if you know the input parameters. So next to the coatings, what is also very important in modules, that we need to find an optimal layout. Because with each subcell that we add to the module, we add additional voltage to it. But at the same time, we're reducing the active area of our subcells. So that means that we lose in JAC because we connect our devices in series resistance, which means that we have the same current density in each individual cell. So those are balancing effects. And also with each subcell that we add an interconnect to make our charges recombine within it. And that changes the amount of actually active part of the devices that actually give you that give out power and current. And that's determined by the geometric fill factor. So the higher the geometric fill factor, the higher the fraction of active area on your given device area. And yes, and by that you can just use CFD simulations to find out what is the optimum amount of cells to get the highest total PCE by simply balancing off the amount of subcells and the parameters that follow accordingly. So in our case, for the evaporated silver device, it was 38 cells. You can also tell by the graph on the bottom right that you can see, okay, that's an optimum that exists. And with that optimizations allowed us to get large area modules that achieve the certified efficiency of 14.5% PCE on 204 square centimeters with quite high fill factors. So the layout optimizations and the coating optimizations help you to get very high efficiencies even on comparably large areas. But again, this is evaporated silver. So how does it go for nanowires? Here, the interconnects are a little bit different because now we have nanowires rather than evaporated silver, and nanowires are not as conductive as evaporated silver. So what you have to know about modules to understand the following is all of the charges that we create within the active area have to be transported in the interconnect. So you have an effective current density in the interconnect that is a lot higher compared to the active area. So that means that you need a quite high conductivity to get efficient recombination in there. So that also means that you have a significantly increased resistance within it because all of the charges have to pass through in the interconnect that is a lot thinner than the active area. So we came up with the idea to reduce the current density within the interconnect by adjusting the width of the P2 line, which is the interconnecting layer. And what we found is if we increase the width, we can efficiently reduce increase the fill factor of our devices by simply ablating a little bit more, just increasing the width. And we can even get higher efficiencies on the total area because the reduction in geometric fill factor is not as big as the improvement in fill factor that you get of it. So then we had to know, okay, what is the optimal P2 width that we can use for our devices on 200 square centimeters? And for that, we did a more or less bridge setup with a P2 line in between ITO class. Then we put the stack on top and basically had a P2 bridge in between. And then you just measure the resistance with 2 pins on the left and the right-hand side. And you basically have the interconnect twice. So you have to divide the resistance that you get out of the AV curve by 2. And that allows you to get the resistance, but it also has the resistance of the ITO in it, because depending on how close your needles are to the bridge, the ITO, of course, also plays a role because it also has a resistance comparable to the interconnects. And so we plotted for 2 different P2 widths, the resistance for the dependent on the distance, and then you can get a linear fit that and from the slope of it, you will find what the resistance of your interconnect is, and the intersect is the system resistance that also includes the ITO. And with that, in our case, it was around 0.6 ohms times square centimeters. And with that, you can do a simple calculation. So on the right-hand side, you can see a graph with the variation of the P2 width. If you start with very thin P2s, you end up with quite high resistances, and it gets significantly lower within the region of 20 to 80 micrometers. So here you can really win in effective series resistance within the interconnect, which allows and explains why you can get higher fill factors. And with that, I put it into a CFD simulation, and I found that for a cell width of around 3.4, so that would be 42 cells for the given substrate sizes, we can achieve, according to the simulation, with an input curve of the best cell that we did, that we can achieve more than 12% theoretically with the optimum layout. Of course, there will be some losses too, but we used that layout to fabricate a large area module that is fully solution processed. You have a picture of an example of it on the right-hand side, so it's still transparent. And with that, with the mirror as a background, the champion device achieved a PCE of 11.75% on the total area and over 12% on the active area, which is quite high. I also gave you the thickness of the active layer. And if you compared it to the evaporated silver, of course, it's not as high because also the silver is more conductive, the GFF is higher, and so on. But it still shows that we mainly lose due to the conductivity of the top electrode. And with the optimizations that we did, we can significantly reduce the losses compared to the evaporated silver. Okay, so, and of course, what about devices if they're not stable? So I put some cells in this case. This is 0.4 square centimeter cells with a silver nanowire top electrode underneath the metal halide lamp with a UV filter attached. So it's close to application degradation. And as you can see, the devices look very stable even after 2,500 hours. And to make sure, because you can see there is an artifact at around 1,800 hours, I wanted to make sure that those measurements are still real. So I took the device out and measured them again with the same setup that they were used to measure them initially. And so the results of that was quite comparable. So for this specific devices, we didn't reach the T80 time after 2,500 hours with metal halide lamps with a cutoff filter. So the key achievements of the stuff that I was talking about, that we achieved sustainable processing because everything was done in ambient conditions with non-halogenated solvents. We have a scalable processing procedure with silver nanowires. And it's a fully solution process stack that is semi-transparent, and we can show that we can also do it on quite large areas with a comparably simple setup. And the stack also shows a high stability under close to application conditions. So we have a paper coming up on that specific topic where there will be a little bit more detail compared to the talk. And without further ado, I can only thank you for your attention, and I'm open for your questions.